I tried to record yesterday, but it did not get saved. I don't know why, but let's go. So here we just saw that there are two types of evidences, internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence is the evidences like direct evidences, which is of text and grammar and the language by itself and the speaking, pronunciation, etc. External or indirect evidence is archaeological finds, people who commented on the language and they wrote about it. So that is considered as an external or indirect evidence. So I just explained generally about all these in the seven ages, even about England, the beginning of English. I explained about this also up there. All these were explained. See, there are so many examples over here that you don't need to memorize, you don't need to learn. The most important parts, as we discussed earlier, just focus on them. These are just examples that you can take if you want to, but I would recommend you not to because it's going to make you more confused and you have so many more chapters to focus on. These are also examples of West Saxon and of Northumbrian version. And the modern English version right now, we're just seeing the differences over here. And we reached to Danes and Danes law. So let's get started. So we said, first of all, British Isles was invaded by the Roman, then the Roman left. Second, they were invaded by Anglo-Saxon people, and then they stayed over there forever. Then third, they were invaded by the Scandinavian. Yes, they were invaded by the Scandinavian people. A few of them stayed and a few of them left. Then they were invaded by French. But before invasion of French, before French came and invaded altogether, in between Viking invasion and French invasion, there was another invasion called as the Danish invasion. There was another group of people, another place from where people came and invaded, and they came and stayed there in the British Isles, called as the Danish people. Okay, see here, Danes and Danes law. So first, Vikings, they came to Scandinavia in this year 783 or 793. It is not exactly confirmed. And they stayed there long enough to slaughter the monks. We told that they stayed there to kill, to take the treasures, and they left. But a few of them stayed back and stayed the summer, and they continued staying there. And then in the second half of the century, Danish invaders brought armies over to view the conquest and permanent settlement. So there was another invasion by another group of people called as the Danish people. And they came and they invaded the British Isles, and they wanted to take lands and stay there. Khalas, they want to invade and they want to stay over there forever. So the Danish invaders, when they came over there, they took over almost all the other territories of the British Isles, but they couldn't take the territory of King Alfred, that was Wessex. So what did they do? The king of Wessex, King Alfred, and the king of Danish people who came and invaded the British Isles, he was called as King Guthrum. Okay, so King Guthrum and King Alfred, they made a deal. Okay, they came up and they made a deal that King Guthrum is going to control all the other areas of the British Isles. That is the east, it is there over here, Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. These were the places, the three places that they conquered and they were staying in, okay? And King Alfred was in Wessex. So they made a deal that King Guthrum, that is king of Danish people, he's going to have control over Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. And King Alfred is going to have control over Wessex. And it was at this time, after this, they were living in harmony. Danish people were living. King Alfred, Wessex was on its own. Everybody was living a normal life at that time. Nothing was happening. These all are before the French people came, okay? So they were staying for a good amount of time. Now here, there is evidences that the Scandinavian, the Vikings who stayed over there, the Danish people who stayed over there, the Anglo-Saxon people that were there, they all lived like, not, I cannot say together completely, but they were mixed up. They were living mixed up all together over there because they took from each other's languages. There are evidence over here, like by, it means village. So right now there are so many places in Britain called as Grimsby, Whitby, and the word by is taken from Vikings language, that is Norse, okay? And another word is thorpe. It means farmstead, like farm place. So there is places called as Grimthorpe, Scunthorpe in British. So these are just examples that they lived together and they learned from each other's language and they took words from each other's languages. So is it clear now? Are you able to understand now this part? Because last time when we discussed this part, we're not able to understand it. So are you able to understand these parts now? Just let me know in the comments.
Yes, it's clear till now.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Yesterday we all were tired. That's why. That's why we're not able to get it. Okay, so let's see. So there was the place, the areas which was controlled by the Danish king, King Guthrum. It was called as Danes. Okay, here is the map. So we see that Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. This area was controlled by King Guthrum, the king of Danish people. So this area was called as Danes. Khalas, he named it as Danes. And you see this line over here. This is where the both people, they were kind of people from this side and people of this side, they were together living. So let's just read this part. Within the Dane law, it appears that Danes and Angles lived together. So Danes are the people, okay? Danes are the people who lived in this area, and this area is called the Dane law. Okay, the areas that was controlled by the Danish king, King Guthrum, it was called as Dane law. Dane law. And the people who lived over there, they are called as Danes. So you see Danes and Dane law. Danes are the people who lived in Dane law. And Dane law is the place where King Guthrum ruled. Okay. So within Dane law, it appears that Danes and Angles lived together and intermarried. They probably understood each other's language to a certain extent, and the English that developed in this area was strongly influenced by the Norse language, perhaps to an extent that a hybrid variety developed. So it appears, according to archaeologists and the people who commented on the language, they're saying that they thought that maybe Danes, the people who lived in Danelaw, and Angles, the people who lived in the King Alfred area, they lived together, they married each other, they were so close to each other, intimate relationships, and they took from each other's language. Also, both of their languages was affected by Norse language, the Viking language. So it also shows that Vikings were also there at that time, okay? So they probably understood each other's language to a certain extent, and the English that developed in this area was strongly influenced by Norse language, perhaps to the extent that a hybrid variety developed. So a new variety developed at that time, because the English at that time, there were different groups of people. There were the Danes, the Angles, and the Vikings. So the English language that was developed at that time, it was influenced by these three people. It was the Danes, the Angles, and the Vikings. We do not have written records of this Anglo-Norse variety, but when written records from this area emerge in the Middle English period, the density of Norse loanwords is striking. Many of these words were to find their way into standard English where they remain widely used. Egg, husband, skin, sky. So these are examples of Norse language in English language, loan words of Norse language in English language. So egg, husband, skin, and sky, these were the Norse language, the language of Vikings. And it is there right now in our standard English. They are mostly words relating to everyday life, bearing witness to the intimate relationship between those of Danish and the Anglian descent in the Danelaw. So here, from this these words that are used, from these words they are interpreting, they're thinking that, okay, the words like egg, husband, skin, sky, these are words that we use daily in our life. So maybe these people were close to each other. Maybe the Danes people and the Angles, they were married, they married each other, they were living together. So that is why they're saying that these were because of these words, these evidences that they were living together. Here, the only thing that we are going to, the only thing we read, the only important part is, there are so many words, I know, but you don't have to memorize all of them. The only thing you need to remember is that the Danes and the Angles, they lived together, and their language was the English at that time. It was influenced a lot by the Norse language, and it shows that they were so close to each other. The Angles, the Norse, they were close to each other, and they knew how each other's language. The loan words that was there in the English language at that time are words that is used in daily life. So it proves that they were living together and in intimate relationship. So these are some examples. Then here, other words of Norse origin survive in present-day dialects of regions. Ones in Danelaw, Orton, and Wright state several thousand of Scandinavian loan words are found in the present-day dialects. So these are just examples like gimmer, lake, lop, and slape that is right now used in the standard English. These are some more examples. You don't need to memorize anything from here. You can just take a few examples. This is egg, husband, skin, and sky, which is easier, and it is definitely enough to write it down. These examples over here, from here onwards, you don't need to memorize them. Not important. So here it's just showing that this is Danelaw, the place where King Guthrum was ruling, and Wessex was the area where King Alfred was ruling. So this was called as Danelaw, and the people who lived there were called as Danes. Between 1952 and 1961, the Survey of English Dialect collected examples of British dialects before, as researchers believe that these died through increased social mobility and media influence. Nothing important over here. You don't have to memorize anything, and I'm not going to read it also because it's going to make you more confused. So we're not going to see this part. It's just talking about a survey that the people did in between 1950 to 1961 to see about the dialects, which dialects survived more and which dialects survived less. So there's nothing important over here to learn. You can just put a mark, like, you know, a cut mark over here. So whenever you're going back to reading, don't make yourself confused when you reach this part. Apart from the standard English word stream, three main responses were elicited: burn in the far, brook, west, much south. These are also examples, not really required. We don't really have to take these ones. I wouldn't recommend you because it's going to make you even more confused. These are just examples that Norse language has influenced English language quite a lot. We can still see the influence of Viking settlers in street names. York in the heart of Danelaw and Chesterfield on its border both have a number of gate streets where the Norse word gata. By the way, the word gate has come from the word gata, which is a Norse word for gate. So this is examples again that Norse language has on English language. Street names influenced by the Viking settlers. So this one is an easy one. for examples, if you want, you can write from here as well. Examples that Norse language has influence over English language. This is an easy example. We can read it and we can do it. It just says that, I will just explain it to you, that there are so many street names that is influenced by the Norse language. The word gata, G-A-T-A, is a Norse word. And right now we use that word as gate, G-A-T-E, modified as gate. So there are so many names, street names like Michael Gate, Copper Gate, Nifismith Gate. So these are some words that are influenced from Norse language. So you can use this examples over here if you want to write. It is easy examples, not difficult one. The influence of Norse and Danelaw affected grammar as well as vocabulary. For example, the northern dialects of Middle English adopted the Scandinavian pronouns they, them, and their for third-person plural pronouns. Okay, this was another fascinating information for me. Vikings, I don't see, personally for me, I don't see Vikings as intelligent people. I don't know why. There are so many reasons behind it. So this is an important part of English grammar that was influenced by Norse language, by the Viking language. So in Norse language, they use the words they, them, their, and it's from there that English language has taken these pronouns, that is they, them, and their as third person. In English, in original English, the pronouns in Old English forms, it was he, hera, and him, which were more confusing for, you know, when these were the plural forms. For he was this, it was written like this. For her, it was hera. Then him was all together. So it was really confusing for them. So what they did, they took the variety that was influenced by the Norse language, and that was they, them, and their as third person plural pronouns. And this is another example that you can use. This is a strong example, by the way. So you can use this example in your essay whenever you're writing about the Norse language influence on English language. So basically that is it. They have taken so much grammar is also affected, has also been taken from Norse language. Influence of Norse and Danelaw affected grammar as well as vocabulary. The northern dialects adopted the Scandinavian pronouns they, them, and their as third person, and that's what became standard in standard English right now. Before it was like he, hera, and him, which was confused by the singular form that was he, her, and him. These th forms would find their way into standard English in the 15th century. The legacy of the Scandinavian settlers in England can thus be found today both in regional dialects of the era and in the standard language. So this is an example of how Norse language influenced English language. This example is a strong one. You can use it. I believe it will definitely get you good marks. And that was it about Danes and Danelaw and about Vikings. Okay, so let's just revise once again what we took over here. In Dane and Danelaw, after the Vikings came and they were living over there, another group of tribe of people came that were the Danish people. They came and took most of the territories. King Guthrum was their king of Danish people. They took Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. They couldn't take Wessex, so they made a deal with King Alfred from Wessex, and they made a deal with them so they would live in harmony, and all these three places, that is Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, would be of King Guthrum, and Wessex would be of King Alfred. Later on, these three places, this Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, it was named as Danelaw. For this part, maybe they would ask you to write about Danes and Danelaw directly. If that would be a direct question, it would be like write about Danes and Danelaw, or what happened in the later Old English period. So this is what happened in the later Old English period. So that would be the question if it would come from this part. So then the Vikings, they were living over there from before. So there were some Vikings in the Wessex, not exactly in the Wessex area, but in the Danes Law and in the other areas, they were scattered. So there's a lot of influence of their language in English language. And the people, the Danes, Danes are the people who lived in Dane law under the rule of King Guthrum, and there are evidences that these Danes and Angles, they kind of lived together, maybe intermarried, and they were having intimate relationships, and so many words has been exchanged between them. Words like egg, husband, skin, and sky are examples that was taken from Norse language in Dane's law, and these just show that they had relationships with each other. Maybe they were so close to each other, and there are so many words that is from Norse language that is in the standard English right now, and these are all examples, but the examples that we will focus on is this and this one over here. It could be that the word gata, and which is in standard English right now, gate. There are words like Coppergate, Micklegate, etc. And then the pronouns they, them, and their was taken from the Norse language. So this is it for this part. This was the late English period. Okay, so if they ask you to write about the later Old English period, you're going to write about Danes and Danes law. Yep, that's about the later Old English. And now we're going to go to the Middle English. We're going to go to Middle English, and that is the Norman Quest in French in England. So what was the Norman Conquest? It was, we're going to read along and we will go through it. As we said, this is the Middle English period. So if they ask you to write about the Middle English period, you're going to write about this part. So we have seen that by the middle of the 11th century, the written English of Wessex was beginning to be used as a literary language, but Latin was still used in church, and an Anglo-Norse dialect was used in Dane law. These were accompanied by a myriad of other dialects across the country, which I will discuss in the next section. The Norman conquest of 1066 was to introduce another elite language which would take over English in higher status functions, Norman French. The Norman French of the conquerors and the more prestigious Central French of their descendants were to have a deep and lasting effect on English. So now Dane's law happened. There is Danish people over there, and they're living in harmony. King Alfred tried to make English, the West Saxon dialect of English, to become not a standard, but a main language. He started to translate Latin documents, Latin Bible, religious texts, everything into English, but then it was interrupted by the Norman conquest. So, and what is the Norman conquest? What was their main motive? Their main motive was that they wanted to bring in the Norman French in England at that time, in the British Isles at that time. So what did they do? They came in and they took over, they invaded, they took over the British Isles, and French became the language of the elite, and it became the first language. The first language, we're going to see it later, but it became one of the main languages that was spoken over there. So there is a plaque in Durham Cathedral showing the names of bishops from the 10th century onwards. It is noticeable that all the bishops from Aldun to Ethelwine have Anglo-Saxon names, but just 5 years after the conquest, a bishop with typically Norman name, William Walcher, is installed, and throughout the rest of the 11th and 12th centuries, all the bishops likewise have French names. This is a striking example of how William of Normandy gave the important post of church and state to his followers at a stroke. The English governing classes were deposed. So what it says over here, there is a cathedral. A cathedral is like a church. I'm not exact. It's like a place where Christians go. It is like a church, but it's bigger. And I don't know what is the difference between a church and a cathedral, but they are somewhat similar to each other. So there is a cathedral called as Durham Cathedral, and it was there in the British Isles. Okay. So a plaque is like a board that has name of the bishops. Bishops is like how we have imam in our mosque. In cathedral, they have bishops. So these bishops, whoever was there in that cathedral, their name was written in a board. Okay, so whoever was there for a period of time and then left or died or whatever, and then another one came. So all the names were written in a plaque. It's called a plaque. A board in which names are carved is called a plaque. So there was a plaque in Durham Cathedral. Okay, and in Durham Cathedral, there were names of bishops written in the plaque. So from year 995 to year 171, names like Aldun and Ethelwine, etc., to Ethelwine, from Aldun to Ethelwine. These are names of bishops, okay? These are the names of Anglo-Saxon people, okay, who were bishops at that time. But 5 years later, the names after Ethelwine, it's like names like William Watcher. Do we have to know these names? No, you don't have to know these names exactly, but it would be better if you write them as an example, but I don't think that it's necessary for us to remember these names. You can just write down that in the beginning, the bishops' names were Anglo-Saxon names, but 5 years later, after the conquest, the bishop names became William Walcher. William Walcher is an easy name. I think you will be able to remember it. So William Walcher, etc. They all were French names. So this shows that William of Normandy, he's basically the person who kind of invaded, a big person in the British, who came from French and took over the British Isles. So he gave the role of bishops to French people and took away the role from the English people. So this is what is explaining over here. The main reason that we have all these names and everything is just to say that William of Normandy, he gave the role of bishops to French people and took it away from the English people. Proof, the evidence is that there were names in the plaque from Aldun to Ethelwine were all Anglo-Saxon names. But then after Ethelwine, 5 years later, names such as William Walcher, etc., came over, and these are French names. So this is an evidence that William of Normandy, he gave important posts of church to his followers, to his people. From this time until the 13th century, the ruling and the governing classes of England would have French or Anglo-Norman, the variety of French which developed as their first language. So from that time until 13th century, okay, from the time when Norman quest started, and that was, I think, in the 10th century, from 10th century to 13th century, all the higher class people, the ruling people are like the ruling people, the governing classes, they are like the high class people in politics, in government people, kings, etc. They all were speaking French, like an Anglo-French, a new type of English that was Anglo-French, where the words were influenced by French language. So they used to speak a language that is Anglo-Norman. They don't say it French over here, they say it Norman French. So it's an Anglo-Norman, but wherever you see Norman, it means French. So they used to speak Anglo-Norman, and this was a new variety that developed because when French came and took over, so it was like they took words from French and everything, and it became the first language of the people who lived over there in England, the higher class people. The nobility retained lands in Normandy, so England was a colony rather than their homeland. So Normandy is basically, I don't know, is it the name of France at that time? That is Normandy, or was there a land over there called Normandy? I'm not sure about this information. It's not written over here in the book, but Normandy is something related to France, okay, at that time. So this Norman, uh, by Norman, they mean like people who came from Normandy, okay? And Normandy, I don't know if it was an older name for France, or was it a land, a territory in France. I'm not sure about that because that information is not given over here, but it is something related to France, okay, the land France. So the people who came from there are called as the Norman people. The language they speak is called Norman language, and the place they came from is called as Normandy, okay? So whenever you see Norman and Normandy, it's Norman means French, and Normandy might be France, or it might be a territory in France. I'm not sure about that, but it has something related to France. Maybe this was an old name for France, and now they changed it and they made it France, and the language they speak in French. I'm not sure about that information. The variety of French which developed in England, okay, as their first language. The nobility retained lands in Normandy, so England was a colony rather than their homeland. So the higher class people, the nobility means like, you know, the very, very, very high class people of France at that time. I will say Normandy because here it's Normandy. So whenever you're writing in your paper, make sure you write Normandy and not France. And you write Norman people and not French people, and write Norman language and not French language, okay? So, but Normandy, maybe it's France, or maybe it's a territory in France. Norman is the language they spoke. And again, Norman is also the people who lived over there. So the nobility, the higher class people who lived in Normandy, okay, their main land was Normandy. So that was the original place they wanted to live in. So England was just like, you know, a colony for them, a place where they can come, enjoy, have fun, etc. So it was like a colony, another place that they have conquered, but their main focus was in their own land, and that is Normandy. That was their homeland. Although there must have been a certain amount of French-English bilingualism for the sake of communication, English in this period was a vernacular rather than an English of status. So here they're just saying that English, even though maybe you know, these Norman people, they spoke English, but they did not speak that much. They spoke very less, just for the sake of communication. And English status at that time was not sure that what is the status of English at that time. Rather, French was having a higher status than English. The language of the church and of learning was Latin. Okay, the language of church was Latin. The language of literature was French. Language was French, because it was the language that was preferred by the kings of England. So now the kings of England at that time, they were not using English language, they were using French language, because that's the language of higher class people. So all the literature were written in French, and the language of church was Latin. So English did not have any role at that time. Other languages were spoken in specific parts of England during that period. Immigration of Low Countries, Belgium and Netherlands brought Low German to East Anglia, and Cornish was still spoken in Cornwall without even taking into consideration the dialectal diversity of English. It is evident that England at this time was a multilingual nation. So in this time, English did not have any status. Moreover, there were more people, immigrants, who came to England at that time from Netherlands, from Belgium, and they brought their own dialects, they brought their own additions, their own languages. And then there was Cornish that was speaking in Cornwall. So at that time, England was a multilingual nation. It was a nation who spoke more than one language. They spoke many languages at that time. So it was called as a multilingual nation. The difference in status between French and English was commented on by Robert of Gloucester, who wrote a chronicle of English history in the late 13th century. So here they're just showing the difference between the English language and the French language. There was a person called as Robert of Gloucester, and he wrote Chronicle of English History in the late 13th century. Norman French, yes, Normandy, and I will just type it here. Normandy, maybe it is France. Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe it is France or territory in France. Okay, so maybe it is France or maybe it's a territory in France. I'm not sure about that, but it has something to do with France. So Normandy is a place. It's maybe the old name of France. I'm not sure about the information. It's not written over here. So here, there's a person called as Robert of Gloucester, and he wrote Chronicle of English History. And the translated version, it says that thus England came into Normandy's hand. So it came in the hand of the Norman people, and the Normans could only speak their own language and spoke French as they did at their home, and also taught their children French, so that noblemen of this country of their blood keep the language they received from them. For unless a man knows French, people don't think much of him, but men of low status stick to English. So this person, he compared English language and French language, and when he wrote the Chronicles of English History, and according to him, he said that England came in the hand of Normandys, the Norman people, and they spoke French, or the Norman language, Norman or French. And they even taught their children how to speak French, so they knew how to speak French. And he said that at that time, if a person did not know French, that person was considered as a low-class people. And if the person knew French, he was considered as a high-class people, as a high-class person. But if he spoke English, he was of a lower class. He was of low class, low status. He had a low status. So here, there is a bunch of examples from where we can see that there is a French loan words in English language, okay? You don't have to remember all of these, but you can take examples from here. There is an important point over here in these examples. I'm not going to read it, but I will just say it to you. You will get really confused if you read it. So what is the important point over here? It is showing the relationship between the higher class people and the lower class people, okay? Through language. So the higher class people, they have more money and they're rich. So they think about fashion, they think about prince and princesses, kings and queens, and etc. So these words, the words like king, queen, duke, duchess, prince, princess, government, chancellor, council, etc. These words are loan words that is taken from French language. And this shows that this was the language of higher class people, and higher class people used these kind of words. Then words that was taken from the Anglo-Saxon people are words like, ox, sheep, calf, swine, etc. So these words are, words of farm, of working class people. And this shows that the standard English right now has words that from Anglo-Saxon people, words like calf, ox, sheep, swine, beef, mutton, pork, etc. No, mutton, pork, etc. is from, it's okay, no problem. We're just talking about the examples that is given over here. And these are examples that show that French people who spoke French had a higher status, and people who spoke English had a lower status, because in the standard English right now, the words, the loan words that we have from French is words like, big words like prince, princess, government, chancellor, queen, king, etc. These are loan words that is taken from French. And then loan words that is taken from Old English, the language that Anglo-Saxons spoke. There are words like ox, sheep, calf, words that is being used of, animals. Maybe they were working in the farm, in the barn, etc. So that's where the words came. So this shows that the the people who spoke French had a higher status, and people who spoke English had a lower status. This is the same thing, but with so many examples over here. That's it. Basically, they're saying that the majority of French loans in English are first cited in Oxford English Dictionary in the 13th century. This does not mean that they were first used then, but they are not recorded in extant texts in English before the time, because as we have seen, writing was mainly in French or Latin in the intervening period. It was not until 1204, when King John lost his lands in Normandy and the nobility conquestly had to decide whether to keep their lands in England or France, that there was any real incentive for the ruling class to learn English. So that is all about Normandy and Norman people. At the end, what the last section, it says that the lands in Normandy, it was at risk. Okay, there was somebody else who came and who wanted to take over the lands of Normandy. So these high class people, the people who were living right now in England from Normandy, they were kind of confused whether to take the land that they have in England, or they go back in Normandy and they fight back for their land. So they chose to leave England, and they went back to their homeland, and they fought for their land, and they got back their land. So they left England, the most important part. They left England because they wanted to go get their own mainland. The land was at risk, and that is why they left and they went back over there. So this was it in Norman and the Norman conquest. That is the Middle English period. So in the Middle English period, we said that the French people came when King Alfred was trying to build up, was trying to make English as a main language, and it was interrupted by the Norman conquest. And the Norman people came over there. They made French to be the main language, the main important language. It was the language of higher class people and the language of elite people, bureaucrats, important political people, kings and queens, etc. And English was a lower class language. Here there is an example that French people were given higher status because in a plaque in Durham Cathedral, there was names like names from Aldun to Ethelwine. They were all Anglo-Saxon names, but then later on, 5 years later after the conquest, there were names of French people like William Walcher, etc. was there. So this is an example that French people were given higher status in England. And here they're just saying that that French people the Norman people who came over there, they did not want to settle completely in England. They just considered England as a colony, and they had their own homeland back there. So the language that was built over there was Anglo-Norman language, because that was a new variety that was built up at that time, because French came and Anglo was like the English language. The Old English was called as Anglo. So that was the language that was formed over there. There were so many so many loan words from French that is there in English language. And also at that time, so many other immigrants came to England from Netherlands, from Belgium, and Cornish was spoken in Cornwall. So at that time, England was a multilingual nation. Then here he's just saying that French was the language of higher class people and English was the language of lower class people. These are examples that prove that French was had a higher status and English had a lower status because of the loan words that we have right now in English language, like words like princess, king, queen, government, counselor, chancellor, etc. These words were taken from French, and these were the higher, the words that was used among higher status people. And then words like ox, calf, sheep, etc. These were taken from the Anglo people, the Old English, and these were the words that was used among the lower class people. So this is just evidence for that. And at the end, the Norman people, they left back to Normandy because their own land was at risk and they did not want to give up their own land. So they left England and they went and stayed back in their own land, and that was Normandy. So yay, we're done with Norman and the Norman conquest. Now we're gonna go to English and ideas about diversity in the 14th century. We're gonna cover this part. Actually, there is nothing much really important in this part, but we will just go through it and then we're gonna have break. Then we will come for standardization. Okay, so let's see, what do we have here? During the 14th century, this is the beginnings of the early modern period. So it is the beginning of the early modern period. We're not going to see more about this because more in detail it is there in the 3rd chapter, but we're just going to take a brief introduction of what happened in the early modern period. During the 14th century, the use of French in England began to decline, although it was not until Henry IV came in the throne in 1399 that England had its first king since the conquest who spoke English as his first language. The gradual shift in balance between the two languages is illustrated in the language passage written by John Trevisa. So here they're saying that in the until 13th century, there were French people who were taking over England, but in 14th century, the status of French, it declined, it went down, and status of English went up because King Henry IV, okay, it's an important king, like King Alfred. King Henry IV, this one V is 4, okay? So King Henry IV, he came to the throne and he was the king and in 1399, and English was his first language. So that is the time when he started bringing English in the lands and declined the use of French language. So there was a shift between the two languages, and according to John Trevisa wrote about this by Higgin, in which Higgin complains that children are forced to learn French in grammar schools to the detriment of their own language. We're going to read this to understand better. This can be translated into modern day English as follows. This custom was much in use before the first plague and since then has changed somewhat. For John Cornwall, a grammar teacher, changed the teaching in grammar schools and constructing from French to English, and Richard Penkridge learned this method of teaching from him and others from Penkridge, so that now in 1385, in the 9th year of the reign of King Richard II, in all grammar schools in England, children are abandoning French and constructing the learning in English. So English in education, we said that English was brought into education in the early modern period, and at that time, before that, English was not there in schools. It was either French or Latin, most probably Latin. But there was a teacher, okay, his name was a grammar teacher changed, okay, his name is not written over here. So there was a grammar teacher, he changed the he started giving grammar to English, okay? English had no grammar at that time. So he started taking from French, learning from French and applying it into English, and he formed the grammar of English, the beginning of grammar of English. And from him, there was another person called as Richard Penkridge. He learned from that grammar teacher and he added more to the grammar of English. And then from him, so many other people learned and they built up the English grammar. So there was no English grammar. English grammar has been taken from Latin and from French. That is what is explained over here. And by the end of which century? By the end of, it says that in 1385, in the 9th year of King Richard, all the grammar schools in England, children were now learning English grammar instead of French grammar or Latin grammar. So Trevisa bears witness here in an important turning point in the history of the standardization of English. Although the grammar school curriculum was to be dominated by Latin for several centuries, after this, once English became a medium of education, there was a need for some kind of standard for instruction. So Trevisa is a person who saw all these events happening, and he's the commentator over here. He's the one commented. He's the one who wrote about all these things that happened in the early modern period. So he's saying that it was a turning point in the history where they had to make standard English, because English, as we know now, it had different varieties, like thousands and thousands of varieties, thousands and thousands of dialects. It was so diverse, and it was a very difficult task for them to come up with one standard English language with proper grammar and everything. So it was difficult. People were not happy with it. They were saying that English is not having a proper grammar. Why should our children learn it? And there were so many controversies happening. At this time, the 14th century, however, there was a little concept of standard version of English. So here we're going to see that which type of English language was going to be considered to be a standard language. So okay, where were we? At this time, the 14th century, however, there was a little concept of a standard version of English, that is the prestige form of English recognized across England as standard. So the language, the variety of English that was chosen to be, worked upon to make it as a standard language was the English that was used by the prestigious, by the higher class people. Okay, so because the higher class people, they are the one who started all of this, of course, they're going to take the language that was spoken by the higher class people and they made it as the main standard language. Even though they chose it to be the main standard language, they still had to work on it even more. We're going to see that in standardization. Oh my God, the word is so big. Okay, so dialects of Middle English can be divided in 5 main groups. So they're showing that the dialects, they divided the dialects into 5 main groups, and there were the Southern, a continuation of Old English, West Saxon. You don't have to remember these, by the way. Kentish, a continuation of Old English, Kentish, East Midland, the east part of the Old English, Mercian era, West Midland. So these are the 5 groups of variations of English dialect at that time. And with respect to the dialects of Middle English, it is worth making 3 observations. First, some of the distinctive features of Middle English dialects have left traces in the corresponding regional varieties today. The West Midland dialect used the word poem, sir, Gawain, and green knight, and a rounded vowel, where the other dialects had this. So now here they're just giving examples of all these dialects and how they were similar to each other, how they were different from each other. We're not going to go through it. It's not really important for us. We're not going to write about it. And So it's better not to go through it because it's going to make it really confusing for us. It is just examples that shows that how these five dialects were similar to each other or different from one another, and how they were pronounced and etc. So these traces testify to the longevity of what are now considered to be non-standard dialects, which diverge from the norm. Although often evaluated negatively in comparison with standard English in Britain today, regional dialects can be traced back to a time when dialect diversity itself was the norm, and no one variety had yet been raised above the others as a standard. So this just says that there were different varieties, and each variety had its own different way of writing, pronouncing, and everything. Nothing much important over here. You can just skip this part completely. It will make you more confused, and maybe you will get scared of reading it, so better not to go through it at all. This leads to the second point, which is the dialectal diversity. The only thing you need to remember over here is that it was divided into 5 main groups, and the dialects were divided into 5 main groups. That's all you have to remember. You don't really need to remember these as well. You just have to remember that it was divided, the English dialects were divided into 5 main groups. If you can memorize these better. If not, it's not a problem. Okay, so this leads us to the second point, which is the dialectal diversity was still the norm in the 13th century, even in the written or formal domains, such as literature or official documents, where today we would expect adherence to a national standard. Chaucer, for example, who had great prestige as Richard II, court poet, wrote in his native London dialect, while poets from other parts of the country used their own dialects. So Chaucer is an important name, not very important, but kind of important name. He was the poet of King Richard, okay? He was the person who wrote poems for King Richard II. So the dialect that he had was the London dialect, okay? He followed the London dialect, and the London dialect was the dialect of the higher class people, and this was the prestigious dialect. Okay, now what are they doing? They're trying to choose a dialect to become the standard dialect. And we said earlier, they're going to choose the dialect of the prestigious and the higher class people. So therefore, the dialect that was chosen to be the main standard dialect, that was the London dialect. Yes, it was the London dialect. So he wrote his poems in London dialect, and there were other authors who wrote in their own dialect. So these are just examples of people. The author of Sir Gawain and Green Knight used a Northwest Midland variety. Piers Plowman wrote in Southwest Midland variety. There was no sense that these poets were deviating from a literary norm in writing their own regional varieties. However, and this is a third point, there are hints in 14th century literature that the dialect of London and the South was gaining prestige, no doubt because of its association with the capital and the court. Accompanying the prestige awarded to the London dialect was a derogatory attitude towards other varieties. So the first point, yes, Hannah.
Okay. Listen, Nahla, in one of the previous tests, it came to define the national standards. If you want to define it, how can we define it?
Define what is national standard?
Yeah.
National standard, how can I explain it to you? What is national standard? National standard is like, let me just check what is it exactly in Arabic, because
is it the standards we follow now?
What?
Is it the standards we follow now in English?
The standard that we follow right now is the international standard. This is the national standard, the standard that was chosen at that time in England. So it was a national, just for England, the standard that they were following only in England.
So we can say it's the English standards that were followed at that time?
Yeah, we can define it as, I will look for a better definition, and I will let you guys know about it in the next class. But for now, just to explain you what is a national standard, it is like the English language, the standard of English language that was supposed to be followed in the nation, in England itself. So that was a national standard. But I will find a better definition and I will let you guys know about it, okay? Yes, I'm having an exam on 24 just like you. I'm a student just like you. Okay, so where were we? Yeah, so here there are examples of people who wrote in different dialects, and Chaucer, he was the poet, the court poet, the poet who wrote poems for King Richard II, and he used the London dialect. So third, there were evidences that the two dialects that was getting prestige was the London dialect and the South dialect, because they were more close to the government, the politics, the king, queens, etc. So that's the reason why these two were kind of nominated to be chosen for the main standard language at that time, standard dialect. So that is what it is over here. Trevisa's 1385 translation of Pidgin, have I already cited as evidence of the decline of French, also embellishes the original author remark about northern dialects of English as evident in this extract. Nothing really important over here. We're not going to go through all of these. The only thing that they're trying to explain over here is when they were trying to choose the language, okay, when they were trying to choose the dialect that will be standard, the things they considered was not only things that is related to language, but they also considered the political value and the social value. The social value that the high standard people are using it. So it will be better for us to take it because it's the language of prestige, the dialect that the prestige people, the higher class people use it. And the second thing they considered was political consideration, and that it was used in government papers, in the courts, by kings and queens, and etc. So these were the two things they also considered, apart from considering the language itself and the properties of the language itself. So that is what it is written over here. That's the only thing we're going to take from here. Nothing else that is more important. He's just sharing his experience and telling about this. But the most important point, as I explained, is that there is the other two things that they considered was the social consideration and the political consideration while they were choosing which dialect to be the standard dialect. We are going to take a break until 8:40, okay, and then 8:40 we're going to come back and we will take standardization. It looks a lot, but it's not that much because there are so many examples in here. Inshallah, we will be able to complete it by 9:30. Inshallah, inshallah, inshallah. So we're going to have break till 8:40 and then we will be back. Okay, I will pause the recording. You all can go and have a break. 8:40, make sure to come back because we will start again. I will just message in the group that we are back. standardization, the last part of this chapter. This chapter was pretty long one. All these chapters are pretty long, to be honest. Okay, so we're going to start with standardization. You guys want to have class tomorrow on Friday, or you want to take break on Friday? Just let me know in the comments. I don't have an issue to give class on Friday. Okay, so let's start with standardization. So what is standardization? It is the process that, yes, we need to finish. So that's why I thought that we will take Friday classes. Hannah, are you okay with Friday? To have classes on Friday? Okay, sure. I will let you know the timing because I'm not sure exactly what time tomorrow, but I will check now. Probably the same timing, or maybe like around 6, a little bit earlier, but I will let you know. Okay, so standardization is the process of making something standard, okay? So let's see how they made English language as a standard language, and the process of standardization, how did it go, and how easy or how difficult it was. We're going to cover it up now. So there were, in this discussion, in discussing the development of standard English, I use a model of standardization first proposed by Einar Hagen. So Einar Hagen is the person who proposed this standardization model, okay? So maybe the question will come that, write the process of standardization, or it might come if it wants to make us more confused, it might come and say that, okay, write the model, the Einar Hagen model of standardization. So it could be, the question can be formed in different ways, but at the end, this is the answer that we're going to write. So this was proposed by Einar Hagen, and it was later modified. They made it more better by James and Leslie Milroy. And the stages of standardization as per Hagen are selection, codification, elaboration, and implementation. Milroy, James and Leslie Milroy, they added one more step, and that is the prescriptivism. Okay, we're going to see each one of them one by one. Now, these stages, stages of standardization, they don't have to follow one another. Maybe it could, maybe the process of elaboration could be before codification, maybe the process of implementation comes later on. So it doesn't have to follow an order. It is overlapped, and it's not following an order. So we're going to see one by one what each one of them is. So the first one is selection, where they have to select a dialect that will be the standard dialect. Okay, they have to select a dialect which they're going to focus on, and they're going to make it a standard language, okay, a standard dialect. So selection is the first process. Then second one over here is codification. So by codification, they mean that they give it rules, they give it regulations, rules and regulations to the language. Now here we can say that they give it grammar, they give it vocab, they give it, they make it as better as they can, so it will be written in dictionaries, it can be learned in schools. So they are focusing more on grammars and stuff like that. So codification is basically they are giving it rules and regulations. They're giving rules and regulations to the language, okay? Then third one is elaboration. Now here they are extending the rules, or they are extending the dialect in different places, and they are elaborating it as much as they can. maybe the dialect is missing something, so they will add that thing in it. If it has something extra, they're going to remove it. So this is the process of elaboration. Then implementation, in the stage of implementation, they are implying it, they are giving it norms, and they are implying it everywhere, like how it is implemented in England, then it's implemented in the countries that was colonized by Britain. So that is the process of implementation. So these are the 4 stages of standardization that was proposed by Hogan. And the 5th one is proposed by the fifth stage is prescriptivism. This was proposed as an addition to Hogan's model by James and Leslie Milroy. And this means that there will be a group of people or a person or whoever, they're going to look and proofread and see if everything is correct. They're going to check if the grammar is correct, if it needs any correction, or it needs anything to become more better. So there are people who are going to check what is right and what is not in the standardization, the stages of standardization. So these are the 4 stages, and the 5th one is proposed by James and Leslie Milroy. So Milroy and Milroy expand the model to include prescriptivism, by which judgments about correctness and desirability of certain linguistic features serve to maintain standard. They also stress that the stage of standardization need not to be successive and may overlap, and that the processes involved in the implementation of the standard are ongoing as successive generations attempt to suppress the variability, which is the inevitable result of linguistic change. So Milroy and Milroy, that is Leslie and James Milroy, they have suggested that these stages of standardization, it is fine if they are not in order, maybe they will overlap one another. And the process of implementation has not ended. It's even going out now. The language is being implemented to places. It is brought to new places. So it is not ended now. It's still going on, and it is successive. For example, we have seen that the first stage of selection comes very late in the history of English. The initial emergence of West Saxon as the candidate was halted by the Norman conquest, and the London-based variety only began to take on prestige after the decline of French in England. So the process of selection started very late after the Norman conquest was finished, and the London-based dialect variety, the London-based variety was chosen as the prestige one and to begin the process of standardization. It will also become evident that in the case of English, elaboration precedes or at least overlaps with codification. So elaboration and codification, they kind of overlap each other. The process of elaboration and codification is kind of happening at the same time, kind of, in some places it's elaboration and some places codification. So it's not one after another, they're overlapping each other. And although prescriptivism intensifies after the codification of standard English norms in the 18th century, it is still with us in the 21st. So until now, the process of prescriptivism is going on, that is checking for correctness of language. So now we're going to see each one of these in detail. So here is it's a story of William Caxton. Okay, he's the first person who brought in the technology of printing in England. And he was a businessman, and he wanted his books to be read by as many people as possible. So he was kind of confused, he was in a dilemma. He was in a state where he couldn't choose which dialect to write his books on so that majority of the people could read it. So he complained, and he wrote that this is his complaint, and according to him, he wrote that that it is very difficult for him to choose one dialect because different people are speaking different dialects and different varieties, and choosing one is really difficult because some people will be able to read it and some will not. And the people who will not be able to read it, they will come and they will create problems for me, saying that why I did not print in their dialect. So it was kind of like a problem for him that he was not able to print the books in one standard variety. He was really confused which variety to choose and which variety to write. So this is him. This is Caxton writing and complaining about his problem. Then, although Caxton here portrays himself as caught in dilemma about which dialect to use in order to please every man, he was in fact writing this in a variety that was already taking on the functions of a standard. So Caxton, he's complaining that, you know, still dialects, that the one that he chose to write his books on is the London variety, is the variety that was slowly becoming the standard variety. But still, there were so many people who didn't know about the London variety. They were speaking their own variety, their own dialect. His use of this printing played a part in its dissemination. As we saw in the previous section, the close of the 14th century brought the first post-conquest king of England, whose first language was English. King Henry IV, his language was English, first language, and that's why English started to take up an important place in England. This meant that English would now be the language of government from about 14,030 in the 14th century, mid-14th centuries. Government documents began to be written in English, and since it was considered vital that these be understood throughout the country, it was felt that the language used in these documents needed to be consistent and uniform. Since government documents were produced by clerks in the Chancery in Westminster, it was these bureaucrats who decided which variants were chosen. So in 14,030, in the year 14,030, government documents were translated to English. And for them to translate it in English, they wanted to choose a variety that was understood by majority of the people, that was understood, everywhere in England. So it was these bureaucrats, these higher class people, these government people who had to choose a variety that would be understood in all the parts of England. So the clerks came from various parts of the country, but were all residents in London. So the clerks, they came from different parts of the country, but they were all living in London. The variety of English used in their documents appears to have been based on London English. So see, the variety that they used to translate the government documents was in London English, with some features originating further north, probably from the east or central Midlands. They also took some, some things, a little bit from the east, East English, a little bit from the central Midlands, but majority of the language, the variety that they used was from London English. We know from population records that prosperous immigrants came from these areas to London at this time, and East Anglia in particular was a very wealthy area due to the wool trade. Some of the more northerly features in what has become known as Chancery Standard English could also have been a matter of pragmatic choice. The northern form, they, for instance, was a more distinctive marker of the third person plural subject than the contemporary southern form, he, although some variability is still evident in Chancery documents. So Chancery was the place where, it was like an institution who was supposed to choose one variety that they were going to use as a standard variety. So Chancery documents, they were translating their documents in London English, but they also took things from other, from the other variants, like they took from the northern variant, they took the word they instead of he from the southern, from the London dialect. So they're just showing that, the process of selecting was also very difficult, because the London variety itself had many flaws. It had many things that was wrong. So they have to take from other varieties as well and add it in the London variety to make it more understandable. Then, for instance, chancery documents have such, or now see the word such, okay? It was written in different forms by different people. It was written as S-U-C-H-E or S-I-C-H or S-Y-C-H. The same word had different ways to spell. And now it is standard, it is one, and that is S-U-C-H. So there were a lot of a lot of difficulty to make it a standard language. This is just one word we are seeing such. Imagine there were so many other words that had different ways of being spelled, and they had to choose just one that will fit in the grammar, that will fit in that will be more understandable and will make sense. So since the process of standardization involves a reduction of variance, it is evident that chancery documents mark the stage in the process of standardization, the selection of a variety. So chancery documents, they are the one who started to select which variety is to be the main standard variety, and they chose the London variety. But still, in the London variety, there were several flaws. So they took stuff from the other varieties, the other dialects, which to make this variety, to make this London variety, this dialect, to become more that to make more sense and to be more understood better. So the process of standardization started from chancery documents. This is everything that was here in this part. The beginning of when you're writing in standardization, in selection, you have to mention about the chancery documents, about here that, not about Caxton, but you're going to write that the government documents began to be written in English, and they had to choose which variety they have to, they had to select a variety. So they chose the London variety because it was the language that was used among the high class people, and most of the clerks lived in London at that time because it was a main political center, a political place. So they chose the London variety. And even though the London variety that they chose, it was having many flaws, so they had to take several other functions from other varieties to make the London variety more understandable and make it, that it makes sense. And chancery documents started the chancery documents were the one that started the process of standardization, because they started to make documents that would be understood all over England. So this part is what you're going to write in under selection. This is going to come under selection from here onwards, this whole part. So here they're saying that why did they choose the London variety? Why did they choose? Why was London variety chosen as the Chancery standard? Why am I saying Chancery? It's Chancery standard. So what is the reason why they chose it as Chancery standard? We're going to see the reasons over here. This is pretty important. You can write about this as well in the selection, that why did they choose, why did they select it. As the Trevisa's judgments above, decisions made by Chancery in 15th century London were not solely linguistic or pragmatic ones. So they did not choose the Chancery, they did not choose the London variety only because based on the language features, but they chose it because of other two features, and that is the political feature and the social feature, as always. So the variety was selected not only because it was familiar to bureaucrats involved, but because it was spoken by elite individuals. Hence the adoption of East Anglian terms. This variety was not inherently superior to any of the others still being used by writers across the country. However, the fact that it was used by the government bureaucracy and that people therefore encountered it in official documents meant that it was endowed with prestige. So the reason why they chose is social and political. Political reason because the bureaucrats, bureaucratiin, they were the ones who were using the London variety, and also the higher class people, the elite people were speaking the London variety. So the higher class people is a social feature, a social factor, why they chose London variety, because higher class people and elite people were speaking the language, and political reason is because the bureaucrats were speaking in the London variety, and documents and everything that was written, it was written in the London variety. Although a standard was seen as a necessary step in the effective governance and union of the country, it should be borne in mind that it was a written standard only, and the dialects continue to be used in speech and informal writing. So this variety itself, the London variety itself, it had several dialects, okay? Just imagine, like one word, such, there are different ways of writing it. So it means that there's different dialects, and different people wrote it differently. So within this London variety, there were several dialects, and they had to choose, you know, they had to select, they had to process, they had to do a lot of work within this London variety itself to make it a standard one. The prestige given to this one regional variety would give those who use it within their home communities greater access to public documents and presumably to the participation in public life, but could exclude those who came from other regions and spoke different dialects. At this time, of course, the effect of selection of this variety of English may have been minimal. Latin, for example, was still the language of religion and scholarship, although Caxton's translations were beginning to make classical texts available in English for the unlatined literate. So they're just saying over here that even though they chose the London variety, even the London variety itself, it had different dialects, and different people spoke different dialect, even in London dialect, by a London variety itself. So it was a really difficult job for them to choose one, to select one, and to select one that is spoken majority and spoken by the elite and spoken by the bureaucrats. So even though later on, even at that time, Latin was the language of religion and of scholarship, and Caxton was, you know, an important person who started translating stuffs into English language. So this is all about the selection. It's all about selection. And now we're going to go to elaboration. Now you see that codification is supposed to come, but we're going to elaboration because it kind of overlapped each other. So now we're going to go to elaboration of function. By the 16th century, there is evidence of a consensus of opinion as to what constituted the best English, at least for writing. So now they had to elaborate. They had to, you know, take the variety, and they have to, you know, choose the best one out of it in writing, just in writing for now, not in speaking. They're just focusing on writing for now. The most frequently quoted text from the period is an extract from the George Puttenham's Art of English Posé. So this person, he wrote something about this. This part in our marker or poet must be heedily looked unto, that it be natural, pure, and the most usual of all his country. See, this is written in the English of that time, but still we can read it. And for the same purpose, rather, that which is spoken in the king's court or in the good towns and cities within the land, than in the marches and frontiers or in the port towns where strangers haunt for traffic's sake. But he shall follow generally the better brought up sort, men civil and graciously behaviored and breed. Neither shall he take the terms of northern men, such as they use in daily talk, whether they be noblemen or gentlemen, or of their best clerks. All this is a matter, nor in fact any speech used beyond the river of Trent. You see, there is no punctuation, the grammar is so messed up, and there is no any proper word order that they're following over here. So there is no full stop, there's no period. So this person, he is writing and he's saying that the language that we are trying to build, it should be spoken, it should be pure, it should be natural, and it should be spoken in the country, and it should be spoken by the kings and the courts and by the high standard people, the high class people, and it should be spoken in the, in the army. It should not be the language of northern men that we speak normally during our talks, but it should be a language that will have some value. So this is what he is saying, and he's saying that that qualities is there within the London variety. So this is what he has said, okay? This is what he has spoken about. Puttenham is very specific here about the geographical boundaries of the variety he recommends, within a 60-mile radius of London. But he also makes statements about the social class, the better brought up sort. The further from London, the more outlandish the dialect. Like Trevisa in 1385, he warns against using northern dialects, but also mentions far west as well as border areas and ports where English speakers came into contact with other languages. So here they're just saying that they are considering the geographical borders of how the language is supposed to spread. And first they're going to focus in London, and then they're going to spread to 60 miles, and then they're going to spread more and more and more and more and more. So they said that we have to make sure that we build up a language that will be understood by most of the people, and we shouldn't take from the northern the northern dialect. They did not like the northern dialect because this dialect was maybe not a good dialect. It was maybe a slang dialect, and they did not really like it. So this text tells us that a London-based standard had been selected and accepted by influential people, though not yet diffused throughout the country, since the north not even noblemen or gentlemen used it. These distant varieties, however, along with Scots and English spoken in Wales and Ireland, were treated as other in texts of this period. The Four Nations seen in Shakespeare, Henry V, these are just saying how it was spread, the elaboration, how it was elaborated. It was elaborated inside London, then 60 miles, then it went and it went and it keep on going. And they were kind of confused, or they were worried that how are they going to take this language, this variety, to the north part, because in the northern side even the gentleman and the nobleman doesn't speak this variety. So it's going to be a very difficult process for them to learn a completely new variety. And these are just examples that show that which people using the London variety and where did they use it. You can just take one example from here. You don't have to take all of it. So Puttenham's text was one of several guides for aspiring writers produced at this time, which testify to the beginning of elaboration of function as the standard variety begins to take over functions previously carried out in Latin. So now they're taking functions from Latin, they're taking grammar from Latin, they're learning how to put words in order from Latin. So they are learning from Latin and they are putting it in the English language. And all the poets who were writing at that time, they got inspired from what Puttenham said, and they started learning from Latin and proposing more functions that can be added in the English language, which could be from grammar, vocab, word order, pronunciation, etc. Until this time, ideas of good style in writing were based on classical rhetoric, which was taught in grammar schools through a medium of Latin. At the beginning of the 16th century, there was a feeling that English was not a suitable medium for serious writing because it lacked eloquence. So they're saying that in the beginning of 16th century, people thought that English may be not a good medium to write because they thought that English is incomplete. It doesn't have proper word order, it doesn't have proper grammar, it doesn't have proper rules and regulations. So how are we going to write on it properly? So when poets were writing in English language in the 16th century, they were apologizing to their readers that we are sorry that we are writing in the English language, which is like which is incomplete and which is doesn't have rules and regulations. We are sorry about that, that we are writing it, and they were apologizing to their readers, by the way. At the beginning of the 16th century, there was a feeling that English was not a suitable medium for serious writing because it lacked eloquence. The publication of style guides such as Puttenham's Art of English Prose and Thomas Wilson's Art of Rhetoric provided examples in English of figures of rhetoric that had previously been learned in Latin. So they're just these people, that is Puttenham and Thomas Wilson. They have put up some grammar, some rules and regulations for English language in their book, and like Art of English Prose and Art of Rhetoric. And people were following these in writing and how they were writing English language. And so enabled writers to gain confidence in English as a literary medium. The earlier part of the 16th century is marked by a proliferation of complaints and apologies, all of which tell the same story. The author is ashamed of writing in such a crude medium, in such a bad medium, in such a raw medium, but feels obliged in order to reach readers who don't know Latin. So these people, the writers, when they wrote English, they apologized to their readers who knew Latin, and they said that we have to write it so that English will reach to people who don't know Latin. So this is a writer called as Ascom. He wrote that he's apologizing, and so for you Latin or Greek tongue, everything is so excellently done in them that none can do better. In the English tongue, contrary, everything in a manner so meanly, both for the manner and matter and I don't know what this is pronounced, that no man can do worse. So he's apologizing and saying that I'm sorry that I'm not writing such an excellent language like Latin and Greek, and I'm writing in English language, which is not the language of elite. So the unfavorable comparison with Latin and Greek is understandable, given that these were still the languages of learning, but English was also described as failing to measure up to the Romance vernaculars because of the Renaissance had reached these countries earlier and their languages were further ahead in the process of standardization. So even though English was slowly in the process of who is Puttenham? Puttenham, do we have to know about him? Okay, Puttenham is a person who had a role in making English, in elaborating the English language and giving it rules and regulations. So yes, he is an important person for you to remember. His book was called as Art of English Prose, and Thomas Wilson, Art of Rhetoric. You have to remember these names. Puttenham's Art of English Prose and Thomas Wilson's Art of Rhetoric. These were the books that they wrote, and it was the beginning of English language having some rules and regulations. So yes, they are important. That's the only thing you need to know about them. So where were we? We were here, yeah. So the language, even though English was in the process of standardization, Latin and Greek were developed, and it was the language that was having rules and regulations, and it was perfect according to them at that time, and it was understandable, and it had feelings, it had emotions connected to it, but English language did not have all those features in them. So it lacked Romance vernaculars, and most of the poets at that time, Romance was the theme they were writing on. So it was very difficult for them to write literature in English. Thus, Andrew Board wrote in 1548 that the speech of England is a base speech to other noble speeches as Italian, Castilian, and French. The key words here are base and mean, but other authors complain that English is barren and barbarous. So there is an author who said that, English is, somehow it is like French, it is like Spanish, it is like Italian. But some other writers said, no, English is not nice. It is barren, it is empty, and it is barbarous. It's not nice. These terms signify that English was perceived as one thing which may be precursor to the process of elaboration of function. It was considered barbarous, base, and mean because it lacked the eloquence of these other languages, and barren because it lacked the vocabulary. The problem of eloquence was overcome by combination of the provision of rhetoric manuals with examples in English and the work of literary figures who even in their lifetimes were celebrated as models of good style. Among these, Shakespeare was just one among many, and a poet viewed as the flower of the age of Sir Philip Sidney. So uh, at that time, when English was still in the process of elaboration, the process of elaboration is the process where they were trying to give it a meaning, you know, trying to elaborate its vocab, trying to elaborate its grammar, trying to learn from other languages and elaborate the language itself. So in that process, the poets did not like English language. They were saying English language is barren, it's empty, it is barbarous, it is mean, it's not having, it's, you know, it's not nice, it is mean, and it's not having any romance. It's not like other languages like French and Greek and Latin, and it lacked eloquence, and because the main problem was that it did not have vocabulary. English language did not have vocabulary as much compared to other languages. There were no words that the poets could use to express what they want to express. So this is what is said over here, that they were complaining, poets were complaining about English language. So now turn to reading Shakespeare in the English language by Jonathan Hope, and reading Hope challenges the common portrayal of Shakespeare as a timeless and outstanding master of words, and instead describes playwright and his language use as firmly embedded in and at an extent typical of his times. Not really important here. He's talking about Hope as talking about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's language. It wouldn't come in our essays, but there he's just saying that he's just talking about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare was very good in using his words at that time when there were very less vocabulary. So he was really good at using his words and using his, you know, to expressing what he wants to say, and writing for his readers. Hope's reading makes it clear that our present-day understanding of Shakespeare as lone and highly innovative genius stems from Romanticism, a cultural movement of the late 70s which emphasized aesthetic and emotional values. As I said you previously, at that time when poets were complaining that there is no any romance in the language, it was because that at that time the romantic theme was very popular among poets and writers. They used to write about romantic theme. So even Shakespeare was most of his writings are romantic. So his words, the way he used his words in portraying what he wants to express, what he wants to say, was really incredible, because there was very less vocabulary at that time, but still he managed to make really good writing pieces from what was available. And distorts the wider picture of what was actually going on in the 16th and 17th centuries. We can see this in the way that puns are interpreted, as well as Shakespeare's role in development of English vocabulary. In comparison with the contemporaries such as Ben Jonson or Sir Philip Sidney, Shakespeare was not exceptional, but one of many writers who made contribution at a time when English vocabulary was greatly expanding. So Shakespeare was one of many authors, many writers who contributed in the vocabulary when the vocabulary of English was expanding. The onus on newness is also our making. At the time Shakespeare was writing, authority rather than originality was valued. It must therefore be borne in mind that Renaissance writers were also borrowing from other earlier works, from each other, and from local speech they heard around them, often in the process using pre-existing words in the new ways and in unexpected syntactic constructions. So the only thing that's mentioned over here is that during the time of Shakespeare, the vocabulary of English language was still being developed, and more vocabulary, it was expanding. And Shakespeare was among one of those authors who contributed to the vocabulary in English language, and they took vocabulary from each other. These poets, they took vocabulary from, you know, from Latin and Greek. They took vocabulary from the language that was spoken around them. So that is how they contributed in the process of elaboration. So the only thing that you need to, you don't need to remember all these names and stuff, but the only thing you need to remember over here that during the 16th century in Shakespeare's time, it was the poets that, along with Shakespeare, the poets, they contributed in the vocabulary in the process of elaboration, and they took from each other's words, they took from Latin and Greek, and they took from many other, from the language that was spoken around them, and they contributed to the vocabulary of the English language. Okay, so as reading it suggests, literary figures were instrumental in overcoming the problem of barrenness. Barrenness was the problem that they were thinking that English language was empty. It did not have vocabulary, it did not have words. The 16th century, and especially the last decade, saw a huge influx of new words into English. So in the 16th century, during the Shakespeare's era, there was a huge, a huge increase in vocabulary in English language. So they took new words, and they added new words, and most of the new words was taken from Latin. This filled a gap in the language left by centuries in which only Latin had been used for learning, writing, meaning that English simply did not have a vocabulary for registers used in domains such as philosophy, science, and religion. In the course of 16th century, the Renaissance and the Reformation gave impetus to translating classical texts and writing learned and religious works in English in order to make learning available to a wider spectrum of society. So in the 16th century, they started to, translate more and more of Latin religious science and philosophy that was written in Latin to be translated in English, so that it will be available to a greater number of people. As the authors producing these words would have had a classical education, it would be easy for them to adapt words from Latin and to a lesser extent Greek into English. So since Latin at that time was the language of religion, and it was still the language that was being used in education, English, they took words from Latin a lot. So it was easier for them to, it was easier for Latin people to translate the Latin texts into, it was easier for people to translate the Latin text into English. The people who were translating at that time, because they knew Latin, so it was easier for them to translate from Latin to English. The efforts of these authors certainly bore fruit, for by the end of the 15,000s, the prevailing view had changed from the English being a cause for apology. Now, in the year 1500s, in those years, before authors, they used to apologize to their writers that they were writing in English, but now they're not apologizing anymore. Instead, they are proud that they are writing in English because it's a language that is so nice, and it has developed throughout the past centuries. I come now to the last and the sweetest point of this sweetness of our tongue, which shall appear in more plainly if we match with our neighbors. The Italian is pleasant, but without sinews, as still fleeting water. The French delicate, but even nice as a woman scarce darling to open her lips for fear of marrying her countenance. The Spanish majestical, but fulsome, running too much on the O, and terrible like the devil in a play. The Dutch manlike, here they're just comparing, they're just describing how each language is, and then they're saying how is English, and English is now in the borrowing from them give the strength consonants, and Italian full of sound, French the variety of termination, Spanish the mollifying of vowels, Dutch gather the honey of their good. He's just writing and saying that, describing each language, that how it is seen by the people. Nothing important in this section. So I think we will be done soon. We're going to go to codification, which is the last part. Of course, there was a political dimension to this upsurge of pride. We need to view Carews' Genoxtic remark of the context of the Tudor dynasty foreign policy and the growth of nationalism and imperial expansion. The reformation when the newly established Protestantism broke with the Catholic Church in the early 15th century also provided a political and religious impetus to favoring English over the language of Roman Church. Some texts praise the plainness and honesty of English compared to the obfuscation of Latin, the publication of the King James Bible. So when in the 15th in the year 15,000, there was, we know that Christianity, there is Protestants and there are Catholics. So in the 15,000s, there was a rise of the Protestants, and these Protestants, they prefer English text over Roman text. So they prefer the honesty and the plainness of English language in the church and everything. So it was then that it started, you know, to be elaborated more and to be there in church, in religious in the religious property of the country. So by the beginning of the 17th century, then standard English had gone a long way down the path of elaboration of function, but this process was to continue for some time. Latin was still to a large extent the language of science and higher scholarship. Right to the end of 17th century, major scientific texts were being written in Latin. Isaac Newton's Philosophia Naturalis Principalia Mathematica was, as the title indicates, written in Latin. However, his later work, Optics, was written in English, which demonstrated by the 18th century elaboration of function was almost complete. So here now is kind of the end of elaboration. I can't believe how Latin was such, you know, an amazing, you know, such a high status language at that time, and now Latin is not used as much. Just imagine what would be the status of English later on. Would there be another language that will come instead of English? I don't know. So here in this part, they're saying that English was elaborating more and more, and the church in the religious matter, maybe Arabic, maybe. I'm not sure about that. Okay, I wouldn't agree with you because now there are words of, you know, English words that is there in Arabic. So I'm not sure if that Arabic would become, you know, an international language because it is kind of declining more and more, and it's not increasing more and more. So let's just see what it was written over here. In this paragraph, they're just talking that English took place in the religious and religion as well because of the rise of Protestants. And in the 17th century, Isaac Newton, he wrote his book, Philosophia Naturalis Principalia and Mathematica, all in Latin. But in 18th century, he wrote his book Optics in English. So this shows that in 18th century, it was in 18th century that the function of elaboration, you know, elaboration of function, the process of elaboration was almost completed. Nothing important over here, to be honest. It's just examples of how words, English words were used. I would not even ask you to read it. This passage contains words in Old English, French, and Latin. Here also nothing really to go to. Other words from Latin are more specialized. Prohibit comes from Latin. So here are just words that has been taken from Latin. If you want, you can take a few examples from here, not all of it, maybe one or two examples, that's all. And here they're just showing how, you know, which words were added, what was contributed and what was removed, and how they made a norm in English language. European is derived from Europe, which was taken from English from Latin, but came to Latin from Greek. The prefix anti comes from directly from Greek, but it can be attached to a word in any origin, mean opposite or against. So you can use this example, pretty easy one. It's going to help you. And that wasn't in the process of elaboration. So the process of elaboration, mainly they were focusing on how to elaborate the English language. How did it all start? It started with, okay, it started from here. Why I feel like this part is easier than the first part. Yes, it kind of is, because it's just talking about how they are elaborating the English language, and it actually makes sense. We can understand it because it makes sense. Previously, it was all about history. Okay, so elaboration of function. The first part over here is that in the 16th century, they started to make English, to elaborate English, and there was this person called as George Puttenham. He wrote a book, Art of English Prose, in which he gave some rules and regulations to the English language, and he wrote that how we have to elaborate the English language. According to Puttenham, it was supposed to elaborate itself in London, because in London itself, the London variety itself had several dialects, so they have to choose one, they have to work on it, and then they have to elaborate with it 60 miles and then go more and more and more. They were kind of worried that how are they going to go to the northern part, because the northern part did not know the London variety at all. But but they were saying that they're going to do it slowly and gradually, and it should be the language that will be understood everywhere around England. Then in Puttenham, he also wrote that there were so many authors at that time. Because of Puttenham and Thomas Wilson, who wrote some rules and regulations, who gave some rules and regulations to the English language, it is because of them that authors were a little bit motivated to write in English language. But even though when they wrote in English language, they were apologizing to their writers of Latin, because they wanted to write in English as it could reach the English speakers. And Latin and Greek was still, it was used in scholarships and in the language of learning, but English was also English was slowly taking its place. But still, poets and authors were complaining that English is having bareness. It is not a complete language. It is empty, and it is a really empty language. There is no romance in it, and how are we going to express our words? And the reason why it was bare is because it did not have much vocabulary in it. But later on, poets like Shakespeare and other poets along with him at that time in the 16th century, they contributed to the vocabulary of English language. In the 16th century, the vocabulary of English language was expanding more and more. And authors like Shakespeare and other poets along with him, at that time, they contributed a lot to the vocabulary of the English language. And they took vocabulary from one another. They took vocabulary from what they heard around them. They took vocabulary from Latin, and by the end of 16th century, it was, there was a huge a huge number of vocabulary being added in the English language, and it was no more bare. And the authors, they stopped right now, they stopped apologizing to their writers. Instead, they were really proud of English language. And this part is not really important. And then here we're just seeing that how English was spread in religion. Because of rise of Protestants, they took English into church. And later on, by the end of 18th century, in the beginning of 18th century, by the end of 17th century, Isaac Newton wrote his books Philosophia, Naturalis, Principalia, Mathematica. He wrote them in Latin, but in 18th century, his book Optics, he wrote it in English language. So it shows that English language right now, it completed the process of elaboration. And here they're just showing that some loan words that has been taken from Latin. And that was it for the process of elaboration. And we are now with the last part. It is pretty easy, codification, and then we will be done with this chapter. Yay! Okay, so let's go to codification. Codification is the process where they give you know, they code it, they give it grammar, they give it punctuations, they give it they write it in dictionaries. So they are writing it down as evidence of English language. So this is the process of codification. So we're going to see how this process went. Although most 16th and 17th century texts printed in English used the standard variety, this standard incorporated a good deal of variability. So even though we said that in the 16th century, 16th and 17th century, they were using the London variety, even though this London variety had various dialects. So whatever was getting printed, it was getting printed in, you know, different varieties. As we saw in the reading by Jonathan Hope, with changing in this period with regard to a number of morphological and syntactic features which were changing in this period, authors such as Shakespeare made use of conservative and innovative variants. It is now accepted that this variability was not unstructured or random, but reflected the social linguistic structure of the speech community. For example, as we saw earlier, spelling variation could reflect regional differences in pronunciation. The process of standardization is defined by Einar Hagen as involving both the maximal variation of function, that is the range of different purpose language can be used for, and minimal variation in form brought by the reduction of variability. So the process of standardization is this is the definition of the process of standardization, underline it. It's important. It might come in the definitions as Einar Hagen, he defined the process of standardization as maximal variation of function. That is, they are taking functions from different varieties. As we said, they are taking London variety is the main variety, but still it's incomplete. There are some flaws. So they are taking more, more functions from different other varieties, and they're adding into this variety. So this is called as the maximal variation of function. They are increasing the variations of function. Okay, that is the range of different purposes the language can be used. Then minimal variation in form is they are reducing, you know, they're kicking out as many other variations as they can, and they're keeping this one variation that they're working on. So this is the process of standardization. The implementation of reduction in variability involves codification, which had barely begun in the early 17th century. In first extent monolingual, English dictionary Robert Caldwell's A Table Alphabetical was not intended as a guide to correct spelling or appropriate use of vocabulary, but as a guide to the hard words which had been brought in from Latin and other languages in the process of elaboration of functions. So this guy, Robert Caldwell, he wrote a book called A Table Alphabetical. He wrote this book because there were so many loan words that was taken from Latin and from Greek, okay? So in this book, he wrote about those hard words, and he wrote about the meaning. His main goal was to, teach people the hard words that they have taken from Latin, and it was not a source of, correct spelling or correct vocabulary. Likewise, the few grammars of English that appeared at this time, such as Wallis Grammatica, Lingua Anglicanae, were intended as pedagogical aids to teaching English. I have to go. Thank you. Okay, you're most welcome. You can go. I'm so glad you came and joined. And anyways, we're going to finish really soon. If you want to stay, it would not take much, by the way. Codification is not that long. So nothing really important in this part, but they're just talking about that how it started in the 17th century. The process of codification started, and people started, writing in books and writing guides of hard words, of vocabulary, spelling, and grammar, the correct grammar for English, to teach people how to write in English. The implementation of the standard involving the process of codification and prescriptivism begins in the 18th century. So the real process of codification and prescriptivism starts in the 18th century. Okay. Johnson among the early modern grammarians by Linda Mitchell. This shows how linguistic authorities was distributed between two emerging groups of language codifiers, grammarians and lexicographers. So during the process of codification, there were two type of people, or two type of group of people that were working on codifying the English language. One was called as the grammarians. They were the writers of grammar books. They were writing about grammar. And the second type of people were the lexicographers, and they were the ones who were producing dictionaries and producing words and vocabularies. So these were the two types of people that were working on codifying the English language. Pivotal in the development of the dictionary as we know it today is Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of English Language, published in 1755. One of the most important dictionaries that came out at that time was Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, and it was published in the year 1755. So let's see, by the late 70s, the role of grammarians had shrunk. Much of the impetus towards grammar writing came from the increasing importance of English in school curriculum, and most of the authors of these grammars were teachers perceived as preoccupied by the finer details of English grammar. Lexicographers, meanwhile, began to provide what was seen as a comprehensive, authoritative, and accessible inventory of the language. The publication of Johnson's Dictionary of English Language was an important milestone both for lexicography and for standard English. So he was saying, now here they're saying in the 17,000s, the role of grammarians tried to go down, and because now English was being taught in schools, and it was the teachers who were making, adding more into the grammar and the grammar that they were teaching in school. So it was them who was working on the grammar and not the grammarians anymore. And lexicographers, they were providing dictionaries and helping in this process a lot. So this dictionary that was the Johnson's Dictionary of English Language was a very important, milestone that they achieved, a very important achievement, because it was, it had so many words, so many vocabulary that let's read it. Johnson made choices between variant spellings, which a few exceptions are still with us today, and his overt prescription of words that he considered barbarous also point to a prescriptive agenda. So Johnson's dictionary was certainly received as a codifying text in his lectures on elocution. So here they're just talking about the different books that helped in making the codifying process easier. You don't really have to remember all of them, but if you can, it is better. They're just talking about different dictionaries, different guides, different books that were written by different people, and how they helped in fixing and modifying and codifying the English language. So an area of English that I have so far not discussed with regard to standardization is pronunciation. Although 16th century authors such as John Hart chose to describe pronunciation of educated speakers in and around London, their primary objective was spelling reform, and that was the stage, no attempt to impose a standard pronunciation. Some 17th century phoneticians, such as Christopher Cooper, singled out certain pronunciations as barbarous, but this was primarily because they deviated from the way they were spelt. Cooper warns that he who would write exactly should avoid pronunciation like Chimbley and service. So we spoke about how English was written, but there was no any way of how English was supposed to be pronounced, okay? So in some 17th century, now there's phoneticians, people who are working on the pronunciation. And one important phonetician was Christopher Cooper. And when he was working on the pronunciation of English language, he was saying that, oh my God, it's so barbarous, it's so not nice, it's so like aggressive pronunciation of English language. So he was, you know, warning people that when you write, you should make sure that you pronounce it correctly. The codification of pronunciation began in the late 18th century when elocutionists such as Thomas Sheridan and John Walker produced explicit guides to correct pronunciation in the form of pronouncing dictionaries. So now in the late 18th century, they started working, phoneticians, they worked on how pronunciation is supposed to work, and they made pronouncing dictionaries. Now you see in the dictionaries, beside it, we have a transcription of how we have to pronounce. So this is what they were working on. Yes, Hannah.
So if I want to talk about the elaboration of English, they started it with their vocab, with the vocab first, then grammar, and now the pronunciation at last?
Yes, pronunciation, they started in the late 18th century. So it was really late, yeah. So they started with vocab, and grammar was kind of like, you know, it was an overlap. It was not like one after another. It was like kind of at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay. But pronunciation was at the end. The codification of pronunciation started in the late 18th century when elocutionists such as Thomas Sheridan and John Walker produced explicit guides to correct pronunciation. Walker especially pulled no punches in pointing out the faults in the Irish, Scots, Welsh, and the countrymen, the cockiness. The latter were singled out for condemnation because living as they did in the capital, they had access to correct speakers and so had no excuse for faults such as edge dropping. Walker was to be highly influential in setting standards for correct pronunciation. His critical pronouncing, so this is the dictionary that he wrote, Critical Pronouncing Dictionary, that was reprinted over 100 times in 1791, as late as 1904, and it was how we are supposed to, you know, pronounce words. It would be impossible to fix pronunciation, and not at all Walker's prescription survived beyond the 19th century. He considered pronunciation of basket, for example, with the long vowel A to be bordering very closely with. So here they're just talking about how, you know, it was very difficult for them to work on the pronunciation now, because now we know there are different accents and thousands and thousands of accents. So now they have to work on the pronunciation of words. It was a really difficult process. So here are just examples of how R was used in the consonant, and if it was used in the beginning, how it was supposed to sound, if it was in the middle, how it was supposed to sound. And they did not focus on other dialects and other accents. The only accent they were focusing on was the London accent. What is important to note is that Walker and his fellow elocutionists selected the speech of educated Londoners. Yeah, this is coming in, this is all general, right? But it will come in codification. I mean, you have to write in codification that, you know, pronunciation was being worked on in late 18th century, and it was a difficult process. Different elocutionists came and they tried to write the pronunciation. This dictionary is kind of important, the Critical Pronunciation Dictionary, which wrote that how you're supposed to pronounce words. And later on, they were just focusing on the London accent. They were not focusing on the other accents, on the other dialects. They were just focusing on the London dialect because that was the dialect of the elite and the standard dialect. Okay. There was a political impetus towards promoting a stable and uniform variety at this time. Now there are political things that is happening over here. They wanted to choose just one variety, and so that when they are going and colonizing other countries, there should be a language that they will be speaking there, and that's the language that other people are going to learn. So that is in the in the 18th century, they came up with the book on grammar and pronunciation that was politically loaded, referring as it did to the relatively recent union. Several authors expressed the view that the unity of language would promote the unity of the nation. So now they wanted to unite the language. And the authors, they suggested that if the language was united, it would show that our nation is also united. Educated Scots in particular sought to eradicate Scoticism from their language and brought in the elocution teacher from England to help them. James Buchan wrote what is acknowledged to be the first pronunciation dictionary of English, Lingua Britannica Vira Pronunciato, the true pronunciation of the language of Britain, in order to help his fellow Scots to speak as properly and intelligibly as if they had been born and bred in London. So the Scots, their language was Scoticism, and they eradicated their language. They now wanted to speak Scots. So they brought in elocutionist teachers from London to come and teach them how to speak in the London accent. And one of this Scot person, James Buchan, he wrote the first pronouncing dictionary of English, Lingua Britannica Vira Pronunciatio, the true pronunciation of the language of Britain, to help his people in Scotland to learn how to speak in the London variety, in the standard variety, as if they were born and brought up in London. The expansion of English to become the national language not simply of England, but the Great Britain was integrally bound up with political attempts to consolidate the new boundaries of the nation. So they did not now in England itself, now the language that they have one national language that they're using, but now they want to expand it in the whole Great Britain. So because they wanted to have a political power, they wanted to show that the main political power is from London. From England. As the British Empire expanded in the 19th century, there was even more incentive to learn and propagate correct English in order to set an example to the rest of the empire. Although we can see that the beginning of prescriptivism in the pronunciation of the 18th century codifiers like Johnson, Walker, and grammarian Robert Loth, their statements are permissive and comparison with those found in the 19th century texts. So the government was giving bonuses and prizes to people who were learning proper English, because they wanted to show that English is now a very nice language and language of elite. If there is one heritage of the 19th century language culture that survives most vigorously, it is the institutionalization of hierarchy among linguistic variants. The 19th century is, in short, a century of steadily increasing linguistic intolerance. So in the 19th century, they tried to make the whole Great Britain speak in that particular national standard that they built, and now they want to let the whole Great Britain speak it. So at that time, there were, people were kind of, they were angry that why do they want us to forget our language? Why do they want us to stop using our language? And they want us to use the language that they want us to learn. We're gonna reach the conclusion. What Bailey also suggests is that prescriptivism is still thriving. In fact, it is flourishing in the 21st century. In 2003, the best-selling nonfiction title in UK was Lynn. So here, nothing really important, but they're just saying that the process of prescriptivism, it is the process of checking the correctness of the language, is still going on. And it has not ended until now. Even now, they're checking, the subtitles of the movies, the books written, and they're checking it, and they're trying to correct it as much as they can. So even until now, the process of prescriptivism is going on, and it is not stopped yet. Even in the secured position as a national language, there will always be those who consider innovations in English to be incorrect and who make prescriptive pronouncements to this effect. So still, English is developing. Still, the English language is having more new, vocab, new words, new grammar. Still, it is developing, and still there is prescriptivism. So there is no any end in developing the English language, and we are done with this chapter. Alhamdulillah. Oh, I'm so glad that we finished it. We're going to just read and cover up conclusion as well. English has, in a sense, come a long way since its emergence as a clutch of dialects in a small island at the periphery of the recently fallen Roman Empire. It is tempting to trace its rise as a smooth progression from relative obscurity to the national language of England. As we have seen in this chapter, its rise was anything but a story of inevitable and uninterpreted progress, but rather one of chance shaped by encounters, often violent, between social groups who brought various languages into contact with one another, as well as by political and social decisions such as selection of chancery standard or the commercial impetus provided by advent of printing. Furthermore, the development of modern day English in England is as much result of people's changing ideas about the language as it is about actual linguistic situation. Okay, I will check. I will try. I was recording, so I'm going to see if it will save. Inshallah, it will be saved. And I will not be able to send it on WhatsApp because the file is going to be too big. I will try to see if it will be uploaded in Google Drive or will it be uploaded on YouTube, how it's going to work. And inshallah, I will let you guys know about it. But I will not be able to send you tonight because the recording has to, first of all, get processed. It's taking 2 to 3 hours for it to process, and then I can upload it. So in the conclusion, they're just covering up everything all together, that English was in a small island where it started, and then look how it expanded to the national language, and then it became an international language, and how social and political factors affected it. So you can read the conclusion, and if you have any more questions, anything you want to ask, you're most welcome. Okay, sure, I will let you guys know when the recording is up. I will message in the group, inshallah. So that was it with our chapter 2. Inshallah, tomorrow we are not going to do U214a. Tomorrow we will be taking a chapter from AA100B, probably from book 2. So I will check which chapter we're going to do. The rest easier, chapter 3, 4, and 5. To be honest, I have just gone through them once. I'm not exactly sure. I have to go through them. I have to study them myself first and then teach you. So I have still not covered up chapter 3, 4, and 5 completely, but I will let you guys know. I think there are less historical events. No, actually, chapter 3 is having historical events because it is talking about how British colonized other countries. Oh, we are the students of English language and literature, and we have a lot of history to study and a lot of things to memorize. Let me just stop.